I woke to the echo of my own heartbeat, sharp and insistent, as though it had secrets it refused to share. The mirror across the room caught my gaze, and for a moment I didn't recognize the person staring back. A boy's frame, yes, but the eyes whispered something forbidden, something aching to emerge. I had spent years hiding beneath the weight of expectation, of names that weren't mine and roles that weren't meant for me. Yet tonight, a trembling courage stirred, fragile as a candle flame, daring me to imagine a self I had never allowed myself to see. I traced my fingers along my jawline, down the slight curve of my shoulders, and the touch sparked a strange, intoxicating shiver. My chest tightened, not from fear, though that was present, but from anticipation. Who could I become if I shed the rigid skin of my identity, if I embraced what felt like the truest reflection of my soul? I had stolen glances at the skirts in the boutique window, lingered over the way silk caressed the skin of others, but never had I dared to reach for it myself. Tonight was different. Tonight, I whispered to myself, I would not just imagine. I began with my hair, untangling knots as if loosening chains that bound me. The strands fell like liquid silk, brushing my face and shoulders in ways that felt like revelation. Then came the clothes, carefully chosen, not flashy, not screaming for attention, just right. Soft lines that hinted at curves, fabrics that seemed to mold themselves around the version of me that had lived quietly in dreams. As I stepped back to examine the transformation, my reflection tilted into something startlingly new, a fragile, trembling embodiment of courage, of hidden beauty, of a self that had long been silenced. The mirror didn't judge. It whispered, in shadows and light, that this could be the beginning. And yet, fear gnawed at the edges of that fragile hope. Would the world accept me if I dared step beyond this room? Could I face friends, family, strangers, without crumbling under the weight of their expectations? I clenched my fists, feeling the resolve harden in my chest. For the first time, I realized that power wasn't just in appearance, it was in daring to see oneself clearly, without shame, without compromise. The night deepened, and the city outside hummed with life. I stepped toward the window, the cool glass pressing against my palms, and let my reflection merge with the lights of distant streets. Something inside me uncoiled, a quiet defiance that whispered, "You are yours, and that is enough." I didn't know who I would meet tomorrow, or what challenges would claw at the edges of this fragile metamorphosis. But tonight, in the dim glow of a single lamp, I tasted freedom, and it was both terrifying and exquisite. I was no longer just hiding. I was stepping forward, one trembling step at a time, into the life I had long denied. Morning arrived like a hesitant visitor, soft and uncertain, spilling pale light across my room. I had slept fitfully, haunted by the reflection in the mirror, that version of me both thrilling and fragile. My heart still raced as I rose, dressing again in the clothes I had chosen the night before, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders as if reassuring myself it was real. The reflection in the glass greeted me. Not a mask, not a costume, but a hint of something authentic beginning to take shape. Stepping outside, I was acutely aware of every eye that might fall on me. The street felt both familiar and alien, each passerby a silent jury. My stride faltered at first, a fragile echo of my own uncertainty, but I forced myself forward. I could feel the gaze of strangers, not hostile but inquisitive, and it pricked at my nerves like tiny, invisible needles. Yet somewhere beneath the anxiety was a thrilling pulse of possibility. What if they didn't see a boy or a girl, a mask or a role, but saw me? The first challenge was subtle but relentless, a mixture of stares and whispers that seemed to follow me like a shadow. I noticed the tilt of heads, the pause of conversations, and my chest tightened, yet I held my ground. Every step was a declaration. I existed, fully, as I had never allowed myself to before. My fingers brushed against the folds of my skirt, a small comfort that tethered me to reality. I am here. I am me. By midday, exhaustion threatened to undo my fragile confidence. I ducked into a quiet cafe, hoping for anonymity. Sitting by the window, I watched people move in and out, their lives untouched by mine, yet somehow the act of being visible in public felt revolutionary. I caught sight of my reflection in the glass, softer now, less like a startling apparition and more like someone beginning to inhabit her own skin. I let a shaky laugh escape, half relief, half disbelief. The internal struggle was relentless. I had always defined myself by limits, by fear, by the roles that others demanded. But now, each passing hour chipped away at those boundaries. My reflection, The subtle sway of my hair, the gentle curve of my shoulders, these were not illusions. They were proof that I could be something more, something wholly mine. And yet, doubt crept in. Is this brave or foolish? Will they ever accept me, or will I always be an outsider looking in? As afternoon bled into evening, I realized that the hardest part was not the clothes, not the eyes of strangers, but the quiet battle within. I was learning to name myself, to claim my presence, to breathe without apology. I was discovering a courage that existed not in grand gestures but in the subtle, unspoken act of simply being. And for the first time, I began to imagine a life where I could step into the world fully, without hiding, without fear, without compromise. The first confrontation came unexpectedly, subtle yet sharp, like a whisper turned into a clap of thunder. I was walking through the park, the golden light of late afternoon painting everything in warmth, when a familiar voice called my name. My heart stopped. I turned, and there stood a childhood friend, someone who had known me before the weight of masks had formed over my life. Their eyes widened, not in malice, but in disbelief, and I felt the fragile threads of my confidence tremble. I didn't recognize you, they said, stepping closer, a mixture of curiosity and concern in their tone. I swallowed. The words caught somewhere between my lungs and my lips. How could I explain that this person standing before them, was the real me, the one I had hidden for so long? My chest felt tight, my hands clammy, yet I lifted my chin. It's me, I whispered, almost afraid that saying it aloud might shatter the fragile illusion. I'm still me. Just different. Their gaze lingered, searching, questioning, trying to reconcile memory with reality. I could see the flicker of recognition, of hesitation, and something deeper, the tentative, unspoken fear of change. For a moment, silence stretched between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I could cross. Then, slowly, they smiled. Uncertain, cautious, but genuine. You look happy, they said. And in that small phrase, I felt a strange release, as if my identity had been granted permission to exist outside the confines of fear. But the relief was fleeting. That night, at home, the doubts returned like a storm creeping in on silent wings. I stared at my reflection again, tracing the lines of my face, the fall of my hair, the softness that had once seemed impossible. Could I sustain this? Could I navigate a world that had been so rigid, so unforgiving, so unwilling to see beyond its own expectations? My fingers trembled against the mirror, and I whispered to myself, "You can. You have to." I began to experiment, cautiously at first, with subtle expressions of femininity beyond clothing, gestures, the tilt of my head, the way I carried my weight, the cadence of my voice. Each small adaptation felt revolutionary, a declaration of self that others might not yet understand. I discovered joy in reflection, in the minute victories of authenticity. The way my hair framed my face just so, the way a simple smile could feel entirely my own. Even as these moments lifted me, social challenges loomed. At school, at work, in fleeting interactions, I sensed the eyes of strangers scanning, judging, dissecting. And yet, each encounter became a test, a rehearsal in resilience. With each nod of recognition, each hesitant smile of acceptance, I fortified the inner self that had long been buried. It was exhausting, exhilarating, terrifying, but most of all, necessary. I was no longer a shadow. I was learning to inhabit light. By the time night fell again, I understood that transformation was never just skin deep. It was a journey through fear, doubt, expectation, and, most crucially, self-acceptance. The mirror reflected not just appearance, but courage, defiance, and the whispering promise that I could carve a life out of authenticity, no matter how jagged or winding the path. And for the first time, I believed that the lost princess within me, the one I had hidden for so long, was ready to rise. The next morning brought with it a quiet reckoning. I had begun to realize that transformation was no longer merely about appearances. It was about inhabiting a truth that demanded confrontation at every turn. Standing in front of the mirror, I studied the reflection as if for the first time. The lines of my face had softened, my posture carried a grace I had only dreamed of, and there was a light in my eyes, a mixture of fear, excitement, and the fragile thrill of claiming myself. I ventured out into the bustling streets with a new sense of purpose, though every step felt like walking a tightrope. People passed, sometimes giving a glance that lingered, other times avoiding eye contact entirely. Each moment was a test of courage, a silent question. Would I shrink under observation or rise into my presence? I caught the briefest reflection of myself in a shop window. Smooth hair cascading over shoulders, subtle curves hinting beneath the fabric, eyes fierce with a quiet fire. And I nearly stumbled from disbelief. This is me, I thought, and I am not afraid. At the cafe where I often retreated, I encountered someone new, an acquaintance who had only known the old version of me. Their hesitation was palpable, a delicate pause that mirrored the uncertainty I had felt in so many eyes before. You look different, they said, carefully, as though testing the waters. I smiled, a mixture of relief and resolve coursing through me. I am different, I admitted, but I'm still me. Their nod was small, tentative, but it carried acceptance, and that alone made the risk of exposure worth it. But the path of self-realization was not linear. That evening, walking home beneath the dim glow of streetlights, I was consumed by waves of doubt. The shadows seemed longer, heavier, and every whisper of the wind felt like a question. Can you sustain this? Can you truly belong to yourself and to the world at once? My hands trembled as I reached my door, my reflection in the glass panel a reminder that transformation demanded both courage and patience. I pressed my palms to the surface, feeling my heartbeat echo back at me, and whispered, "Yes, I can." Days blended into weeks, each moment shaping me in subtle, unexpected ways. I began to notice how clothing could alter more than appearance. It shifted how I moved, how I felt, how I breathed. A skirt wasn't just fabric, it was freedom. The way I carried my weight, the tilt of my head, the cadence of my voice, all became instruments of expression. And yet, the internal struggle persisted, the tension between who I had been and who I was becoming. I wrestled with old insecurities, old roles, the relentless pull of expectation. But in each confrontation, each whispered doubt, I found a fragment of myself waiting to emerge, waiting to rise. One evening, alone in my room, I traced the curves of my face with trembling fingers, marveling at how much had changed, not just outside, but inside. I had begun to recognize the lost princess within me, the self I had abandoned for safety, for conformity, for fear. She was fragile, yes, but fierce, uncertain, yet unyielding. And in that recognition, I found something profound, a sense of belonging to myself that no external gaze could shake. The journey was far from over. Social trials, moments of vulnerability, and the ever-present shadow of doubt loomed ahead. But I had learned a truth I could carry forward. Transformation is as much about the soul as it is about the body, and power lies in daring to see oneself fully and without apology. With each step, each reflection, each whispered affirmation, the lost princess within me gathered strength, preparing to face a world that might never fully understand her. And yet, she would rise anyway. It was a rainy afternoon when I truly understood the fragility and power of visibility. Water drummed against the pavement outside as I walked through the streets, my reflection shimmering in every puddle. I could see myself, hair plastered to my cheeks, skirts clinging with damp persistence, eyes bright and defiant, and I realized the world had not broken me. Not yet. The storm, both outside and within, had tested my resolve, but here I was, still claiming space, still daring to exist. People hurried past, umbrellas bobbing, faces hidden, yet each glance that landed on me was a challenge. Would they judge? Would they scoff? Would they pretend I didn't exist? The questions came and went like gusts of wind, but I focused on my own heartbeat, the rhythm that had become my anchor. I had begun to notice the subtle shifts in my own perception, how I no longer shrank in the presence of eyes, how I carried my weight differently, how my voice held a steadiness that once would have faltered. This was no longer about pretending. This was about being fully, unapologetically myself. That evening, I met a group of old friends at a small cafe, the kind where everyone knows everyone and every smile is weighed with history. Their initial surprise was palpable, an almost physical pause that stretched across the table. I could feel their curiosity pressing against me, measuring, testing, questioning. And yet, beneath it all, there was a tentative acceptance, a willingness to meet me where I was. We talked, laughter breaking through the tension, and I felt a strange exhilaration. The fragile bridge between past and present, between expectation and authenticity, was holding. But self-acceptance was never a smooth path. Alone later, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle into my bones. The emotional labor of claiming identity in a world that rarely pauses for understanding was immense. I traced my reflection in the mirror once more, this time noticing the faint shadows beneath my eyes, the slight tension in my shoulders, the small imperfections that reminded me I was still learning, still evolving. Yet, in those imperfections, I saw humanity, resilience, and a courage that no external gaze could erase. I began to experiment with subtler expressions of my femininity, the way I tilted my head, the arch of an eyebrow, the softness of my gestures. Each small change felt revolutionary, a quiet rebellion against the rigid expectations I had internalized for years. Friends, acquaintances, strangers, all noticed, in different ways, and all challenged me to refine, adapt, and above all, remain true to myself. The process was exhausting, exhilarating, and profoundly transformative. By nightfall, as rain streaked down the windows, I realized that the journey was no longer about hiding or revealing, but about inhabiting my own skin fully, even in the face of fear, doubt, and scrutiny. The lost princess within me was no longer just a shadow or a whisper. She was beginning to walk, to breathe, to rise. And though the path ahead was uncertain, the thrill of self-discovery pulsed through me like an uncontainable fire, urging me forward with every heartbeat. The first confrontation without right judgment came when I least expected it. I had been walking down a busy street, the golden afternoon sun warming my shoulders, when a sharp, dismissive laugh pierced the air. I froze, the sound sinking into my chest like cold steel. A group of people had noticed me, my hair, my skirts, my presence, and in their amusement, I felt the raw sting of exposure. My first instinct was to shrink, to disappear, to wish I could retreat into the safety of anonymity. But then, something inside me stirred, a quiet, simmering defiance that had been growing, nurtured in stolen moments before mirrors and in the careful crafting of my appearance. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and let my gaze meet theirs. The laugh faltered. For a heartbeat, I glimpsed surprise, hesitation, recognition that I would not be cowed. I realized then that transformation was not only external, it lived in posture, in presence, in the refusal to let others dictate your value. That night, I replayed the incident endlessly in my mind, analyzing every flicker of expression, every detail of their gaze. Anxiety gnawed at me, yet I recognized the strange exhilaration that came with standing my ground. I was learning the duality of visibility, the thrill of being seen, the risk of being misunderstood, the power of claiming space that others might deem unworthy. The city lights outside my window flickered in patterns that mirrored the turmoil inside me, and I felt both vulnerable and alive. The days that followed were a crucible of self-discovery. I experimented more boldly with clothing, with gestures, with the cadence of my voice. Each small adjustment was a rebellion, a secret victory, a declaration that I would inhabit myself fully. I noticed subtle changes in the way strangers responded, a lingering glance here, a hesitant smile there. The world was testing me. Yes, but I was learning to meet it with grace, to anchor myself in the certainty that I deserved this space, this freedom, this identity. One evening, as I stood before my mirror, I allowed myself a rare, unguarded moment. I touched my cheeks, tracing the lines of my face, the softness that had been denied for so long, and I whispered a promise to myself. I will rise. I will not shrink. I will claim this life, fully and without apology. Tears blurred my reflection. But they were not tears of fear. They were tears of recognition, of acceptance, of the fierce, fragile joy that comes with discovering that you are finally allowed to exist as yourself. In those quiet, intimate moments, I realized the journey was no longer just about clothes, or appearances, or societal expectations. It was about the soul, the inner landscape of identity, courage, and self-acceptance. And as I lay in bed that night, my body trembling with relief and anticipation, I knew the lost princess within me was no longer waiting in the shadows. She was ready to rise, to face the world, to claim her story, and nothing, not judgment, not fear, not doubt, could stop her from stepping into the light. The first time I walked into a public space and felt truly seen, it hit me like a jolt of electricity. I had chosen a small, bustling bookstore, one tucked away from the main streets, the kind of place where the scent of paper and quiet conversation envelops you. My reflection in the front window showed the familiar sweep of my hair, the gentle sway of my skirt, and the subtle confidence that had begun to root itself in my movements. But this time, it wasn't just about appearance, it was about being present, unguarded, unapologetically. Inside, the world seemed quieter, slower, as if holding its breath. I wandered between the shelves, brushing my fingers against spines of books I might have once considered intimidating. And then it happened. A stranger looked at me and smiled. Not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with warmth. My chest swelled, a strange, dizzying mixture of relief and affirmation. Someone outside my circle of mirrors and mirrors of friends, saw me and treated me as ordinary, as worthy, as fully me. I hadn't expected that, and yet, it felt revolutionary. Hours later, walking home beneath a sky painted with the soft orange of dusk, I felt the weight of the journey pressing gently on my shoulders. Each step was layered with reflection. The old self I had shed, the new self I was inhabiting, and the uncertainty that still lingered like a shadow at the edge of light. I thought about all the small victories, the subtle expressions, the conversations that had wavered on the edge of acceptance. Each moment had carved a space for the lost princess within me to breathe, to grow, to claim a life I had once imagined only in secret. And yet, doubt remained, as insistent as the beating of my own heart. In quiet moments, I wondered if I was truly ready for the scrutiny of the wider world, for the moments when acceptance might not come so easily. I questioned myself endlessly. Am I brave enough? Am I visible enough? Am I enough? Each question carried weight, each hesitation demanded courage. But I discovered something powerful in answering them. The answers were not in the eyes of others. They were within me, in the way I carried myself, in the choices I made, in the quiet affirmations I whispered when no one else was listening. That night, as I stood before my mirror once more, I let my reflection envelop me fully. I traced my jawline, the curve of my shoulders, the line of my neck, and smiled at the person looking back. She was not perfect, not untouchable, not free from fear, but she was real. She was mine. And for the first time, I felt the depth of that truth, that transformation was not just about how the world saw me, but how I chose to see myself. With the city lights flickering against the windowpane, I realized that the lost princess I had long hidden was no longer lost. She had begun to rise, slowly, uncertainly, but with a fierce and undeniable determination. And as I whispered a promise to myself in the quiet of the night, I knew the journey ahead would be challenging, exhilarating, and profoundly transformative, and that I would meet it with the courage of someone finally claiming her own story. The following weeks became a delicate dance between self-expression and societal navigation. Every outing, every interaction, was a test of both courage and resolve. I learned to anticipate the subtleties of judgment, the quick glance, the hesitation in a tone, the flicker of curiosity that sometimes masked discomfort. At first, each encounter felt like a storm threatening to sweep me off balance, but gradually, I discovered a rhythm, a resilience, a quiet way of inhabiting the world that made me feel less like a trespasser in my own life. One rainy afternoon, I found myself at a small art gallery, the scent of oil paint and varnish mingling with the hum of distant conversation. I wandered past canvases that captured moments of joy, sorrow, and the quiet spaces in between. And then a man approached, polite and curious, asking for my thoughts on a painting of a storm-laden coastline. I spoke carefully, thoughtfully, my voice steady yet warm. As we discussed color, light, and emotion, I realized something extraordinary. I was being seen, not as a label, not as a concept, but as a person with thoughts, with opinions, with presence. The simple act of engagement, free from judgment, felt revolutionary. Yet the journey remained fraught with tension. At home, I grappled with reflection and doubt, sometimes questioning whether my transformation was sustainable, whether the acceptance I had glimpsed was fleeting, whether the world would eventually demand I shrink back into old roles. I spent nights tracing the contours of my reflection in the mirror, my fingers trembling over cheeks and jawline, silently asking, am I brave enough? Am I worthy enough? Each night brought a mix of fear and affirmation, exhaustion and exhilaration, but slowly, a stubborn truth solidified. The lost princess within me was determined to rise, and no hesitation, no judgment, no shadow of doubt could erase her resolve. Then came an unexpected test. A longtime friend reached out, their voice laced with confusion, worry, and an unspoken longing for the familiar version of me. They struggled to reconcile the person I had become with the one they had known. My heart ached, partly from fear, partly from love, partly from the realization that transformation often forces others to confront their own expectations. I listened patiently, spoke gently, and let them witness not just my appearance, but my essence. By the end of the conversation, the tension softened, replaced by a cautious understanding, a tentative bridge built from honesty and vulnerability. By the time I returned home, night had fallen, and the city's lights reflected off my window in a kaleidoscope of color. I studied my reflection, the familiar lines and curves that had become mine, and for the first time, I saw a version of myself that was whole. Not without flaws, not untouched by fear or doubt, but undeniably me. The lost princess was no longer a shadow hiding in mirrors or whispered thoughts. She was present, visible, rising steadily with a quiet ferocity. And in that moment, I understood that this journey, with all its tension, challenges, and unexpected victories, was not just about transformation. It was about claiming life, on my own terms, in full presence, and with an unwavering courage that no one could take away. A quiet revolution began within me, subtle but unstoppable. Each morning, as sunlight filtered through my curtains, I felt a pulse of certainty I had never known before. Dressing, walking, speaking, every act became a deliberate choice, a testament to the person I was shaping and honoring. The reflection in the mirror no longer startled me. It welcomed me with calm, knowing eyes. The lost princess was no longer just a fragile hope. She had become a living, breathing presence in every fiber of my being. One afternoon, I attended a small gathering with acquaintances who had only known me in the old guise. The air was tense at first, polite smiles carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. I could feel their glances, some curious, some hesitant, some openly questioning. And yet, I realized that the most important gaze was my own. With each step, each gesture, each word, I grounded myself in a truth I no longer needed permission to claim. Conversation flowed, laughter emerged, and slowly the tension melted. I was still the same person in essence, yet undeniably transformed. The contrast wasn't a threat, it was a revelation. The internal struggle, however, never fully disappeared. Alone at night, I would confront old fears, replay moments of judgment, dissect tiny interactions. Sometimes, it felt like a pendulum swinging between confidence and doubt. But I learned to meet myself in those moments with patience. I reminded myself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. Each hesitation, each pang of insecurity, became a small battleground where the lost princess fought, and often won, her place in the light. Then, unexpectedly, an opportunity arrived, a chance to speak at a local community event about resilience, identity, and personal transformation. The idea terrified me, but I sensed it was also the moment I had been preparing for, the ultimate test of presence. Standing on that modest stage, facing a room full of strangers, I felt my heart hammering, my palms slick, but I remembered the journey that had led me here. I spoke honestly, vulnerably, about fear, acceptance, and the unrelenting pursuit of authenticity. Eyes met mine, nods of understanding rippled through the audience, and I realized that my story, my truth, could not only exist but inspire. By the time I returned home, the adrenaline had ebbed, leaving a serene exhaustion. I gazed at my reflection, tracing the lines of my face, the gentle curve of my shoulders, the life that now lived within me. The lost princess was no longer waiting. She had stepped fully into her own story, rising with grace and strength. And in that quiet, profound moment, I understood that transformation was never about perfection or approval. It was about embracing the self we were always meant to be, no matter the obstacles, and letting that light guide the path forward. Morning light spilled across my room, golden and unwavering, as if the world itself had paused to witness the culmination of this journey. I stood before the mirror one last time in that familiar, intimate ritual of reflection. My hair fell freely over my shoulders, my posture carried a quiet confidence, and my eyes, once hesitant, now resolute, met their own gaze without fear. The lost princess within me was no longer hidden, no longer trembling at the edges of possibility. She had risen, fully and undeniably. The streets outside welcomed me as I stepped into the world with a calm certainty that felt almost alien at first. Faces turned, some curious, some approving, some indifferent, but it no longer mattered. I had learned that the measure of my existence was not in the eyes of strangers, not in whispers or stares, but in the unwavering knowledge that I was living my truth. Every movement, every gesture, every breath was an affirmation. I belonged to myself, and that was enough. I remembered the moments of doubt, the sleepless nights, the trembling hands and hesitant glances. Each struggle had been a crucible, shaping courage, patience, and resilience. I had walked through fear and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. The reflection in the mirror was no longer a question or a possibility. It was a declaration, a testament to every small, brave choice I had made along the way. That evening, I found a quiet bench overlooking the city, the lights stretching like constellations below. I traced the contours of my reflection in the darkened glass beside me, and for the first time, I didn't see the fractured pieces of a hidden self. I saw a whole person, a princess who had been lost, yes, but who had claimed her place with patience, courage, and an unyielding heart. A voice whispered inside me, soft but unshakable, "This is your life. You are worthy. You are enough. You have risen." And as the wind brushed my face, carrying the distant hum of the city, I realized that transformation was not a moment, a look, or a choice. It was a journey, lived fully and bravely, step by step, day by day. The lost princess had found herself not in hiding, not in secrecy, but in the act of rising, claiming space in a world that would always test her, and embracing the light that had always been hers to own. For the first time, I felt complete, not perfect, not untouched by doubt, but entirely, fiercely alive. And I smiled, a quiet, triumphant smile, knowing that this was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a life lived in full, glorious authenticity.